Thanks everybody for joining this presentation. From autism spectrum to multi-spectral living is actually based on a paper co-written with my colleague Francisco Urbistondo Cano, who's not able to join today. He's actually up a mountain in Nepal. So that's why it's just me presenting. But I want to just say a little bit about, and it is slides. It's not going to be doing a wonderful talk off the cuff. I am using slides, and look or don't look, there are lots of words as well as some images. So just the slides will be available later, the recording will be available later, so drop in and out as you wish. So just introducing many me's. There's so many things one can put down about oneself, but I just put a smattering of things. And I think for me, perhaps one of the most important things is growing up Jewish and growing up lesbian and growing up a different kind of woman, meaning I wasn't going to fit into expectations and having to fight back, as it were, or let's say resist all the kind of normative expectations, and then starting therapy as a young adult, and my queerness being seen as probably quite problematic, and then eventually setting up a lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer therapy practice, the Pink practice. And what we decided very early on is that we were going to be an inclusive practice. We weren't going to single out one set of ideas, one set of descriptors, as though you could only come to the practice as a gay person, as a trans person. We were thinking about people as multi-layered, living across many, many different contexts, places, cultures, eras, ways of talking, ways of being able to be themselves or not, or in some places or not. So context has always been important, and being visible and daring. And, you know, I think some of my inspiration has come from queer people, feminists, artists, writers, filmmakers, members of the public, neighbors, partners. But also there's something about needing to name stuff. A lot of prejudice is just beneath the surface, and it acts as a fog. There's a sort of fog that happens that means it's sometimes quite difficult to see what's actually going on. And I put in auntie and niece and cousin because they are some of my connections with autism as a lived experience, and in relation to services or service provision, and the disturbance that's arisen out of contact with services. I'm just moving on to the next slide. So what is a spectrum? And a spectrum is a word from Latin. I think it originally meant something like a way of imaging, something to do with a way of showing things that are not very present. Sort of the notion of a ghostly spectrum might come to mind, that there's something there but you can't quite see it, so how are you going to show it? And what was done by the scientists in relation to light was that they used prisms and so on to show that there was a rainbow of light, with a rainbow of color within light, but you had to show it in a certain kind of way. Interesting to connect with the sunflower lanyard, which is designed to kind of, without people having to explain something and say something, that there's something present for a person that might interfere with or be impacted by their environment, and for others with responsibility for that environment to see something that may not be clear. Anyway, as scientific knowledge was developed, the notion of spectrum was used for other things more than just light, for example, to explore sound waves. But it's also gone on to mean other kinds of, have other kinds of uses. For example, within politics, It might be that it's more denoting that people are at this end of the spectrum politically rather than that end, that there are clusters of opinions or clusters of symptoms. And while in the idea of light, there's an idea of colour, that the rainbow would go back into itself and meet at both ends, where red would become purple or orange, yellow, and so on. In many places, in many more contemporary contexts, the notion of spectrum has come to mean something else. It's come to mean polarities. And so, for example, the autistic spectrum, you might have heard people say somebody's low functioning, somebody's high functioning, somebody's more or less autistic. And so the spectrum is more like a rule or a ruler, a way of sort of trying to measure something. There's a sort of an implicit idea of a sliding scale in which people are deemed to be more or less autistic. It's though this spectrum is some single axis along which people are expected to be placed by professionals who can say where they are on this spectrum according to the existing diagnostic criteria. So you've heard people use that shorthand saying they're on the spectrum. They mean that they're autistic. Many people say, oh, I think they're a little bit autistic. It's become part of everyday parlance now. But the language or concept of autistic spectrum disorder or autistic spectrum condition tend to be a way of saying something about a group of others, often professional language. And this word disorder is very disturbing. It's very pejorative. It has a lot of stuff tied up in it, assumptions about apparently what's normal. Even the word condition can be comfortable for some, disturbing for others. So this is part of the linguistic challenges we face at the moment. But it's interesting to note what kind of talk makes its way into everyday life, into everyday talk, ordinary relationships, and how much power these concepts have. And very interesting how we take for granted, or when I say we, maybe you don't, but these structures that are attributed to professionals a certain type of power to spot, to diagnose, to name, to categorize. And increasingly there's a big move for people to self-diagnose, and people seem to be very comfortable with that, or choosing not to diagnose. So this is an example of what we're kind of, one of the challenges that Fran and I and others, many others, who are also writing about questioning this notion of the single spectrum, are trying to think about. But from a systemic point of view, we try and think about people in context. So the same person could be seen as low functioning, autistic by, a member of staff might say, well, look, they're collecting jigsaws, and the way they do and their feelings about it are obsessive and restrictive and typical of a man with autism. But in another context, the same person, in their work context, somebody might say about them, they're passionate and detailed, and with the training and supervision, they're in charge of stockpiling at the supermarket. They do their job really well, better than other people in their position. So that's a diagram Fran came up with from his work in social care with people with autism and learning disabilities. So we want to ask if there really is an autistic spectrum. Perhaps it's deceptive. It's a professional pronunciation, is that the best word? It's professional activity. But actually, there's no real way of graduating people or sequencing symptoms or severity in a really clear, lineal way, which is what a spectrum would require, because there are no criteria there are lots of criteria, but how to graduate them is a problem for everybody. Well, not a problem, it's a problem if it becomes a problem. So there are no measuring tools to really use to place people, as it were, accurately on any spectrum. It's rather a way of professionals speaking about a cluster of noticeable characteristics or a cluster of features or ways of being in the world, which might be more or less noticeable to other people, depending on, of course, what they're looking for, what kind of spectacles or glasses they're looking through. So the autistic spectrum is a concept that might be for some people more or less useful, but it's not a fact. Like many theories, they've been made up by people. They've not been dug up out the ground and discovered with an aha, look what I found. It's not so much that, it's a concept that's been offered. And we're proposing something called multi-spectra living. So many spectra, not one, and not just static, but moving, intending to problematize the story of autistic people as autistic primarily, mainly autistic, only autistic, so that we, in effect, forget to see everything else, many other things about people, and rather seeing people as autistic people, all people, as fluid and responsive to context, any context, whatever context, and also influenced by the context that they're in. So they're influencing of it and influenced by it and responsive within it. And here we have Mary, who just been speaking. Mary also challenged, tried to stretch the notion of an autistic spectrum when she was speaking at the All About Autism conference in 2019. And she was saying here in the recording of that talk, you've met them on one day, tomorrow their difficulties or their strengths might be very different. So time is also a context, the place they're in. So autistic people are not a fixed list of symptoms, irrespective of context. Different contexts produce different reactions and possibilities. Now I put possibilities here because the possibilities don't come randomly. They're not maverick things that fall out the sky. The context determines how able people feel they can be, and the person's abilities are given an opportunity to shine or not. So abilities are context dependent, and the speed or ease within which our abilities or struggles can move around are affected by lots of underlays and overlays of other contexts. Who's present, what policies are in play, who we feel is monitoring our behavior, maybe something about the material environment, the sound, the atmosphere, the air, but also the language people are using, and of course what opportunities there are for us to be whole embodied people in terms of permissions to move around, to behave or talk in certain ways. And then of course there are all kind of cultural contexts to do with the culture of an organization or a community, and lots of other inherited stuff that may or may not be witnessable to do with the history of different communities. So turning up as an autistic person in a professional, as a professional in a professional context, when there's a whole history of having been seen, or autistic people having been seen as the patient, the service user, is a big flip. It's a big step forward in terms of what it means to be both autistic and professional, in terms of taking up that space, that sense of right and entitlement. So the last conference we ran of this sort was focused on autism and intersectionality. And intersectionality is a term, a very useful concept by Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black American professor, to show, in her work, she was showing how gender and race employment legislation resulted in the exclusion of certain groups of people with a cluster of protected characteristics. Basically, companies in America could show that, yes, they employed Black people, but they only actually employed Black men. They didn't employ Black women. Yes, they employed women, but they only employed white women, not Black women. So Black women went missing at the intersection, were erased, invisible. There were no stats because they weren't employed. So it's a theory to show how some people or communities don't count, don't get counted, and rendered invisible, just excluded from just treatment. So intersectionality addresses the relationship between protected characteristics or any characteristics and fairness of practice. And Fran and I, in our paper, and there's a link to it at the end of this, and there'll be a link on the systemicautism.com site, we're thinking about autism as more than a characteristic or a cluster of characteristics, because they can end up being foregrounded or suggest something fixed, something unchanging across context. But people and their bodies, including their brains, always respond to context. They're fluid and change to some degrees within limits. And the autistic person's brain, counter to a lot of public, populist ideas, partly promoted through certain kinds of modernist scientific research, are not fixed, unchanging things. All our brains are limited by how much they can change, but they are able to change depending on context and over time to different degrees. We won't spend much time looking at this now, but if you see this in this corner here, this is a sort of a wheel that, based on Kimberly Crenshaw's idea of intersectionality and adapted from James Vanderwood's Web of Oppression, and neurodiversity is factored in here, and it's talking about power and power relations. I'm not going to spend much time on that now, but you can see there are many different parts of ourselves in play, some that would be closer to the nexus of power and privilege, and others further away. So this is a term, splintersectionality, that I came up with when trying to think through intersectionality and autism. And it's an attempt to resist a separation of a single characteristic of a person and a community, as if it's the primary way of seeing somebody. So instead of splintering off autism from the whole person, it needs featuring, a bit like it is here under neurodiversity. It needs featuring, it needs rendering visible, but how it's rendered visible is part of the challenge. And part of the challenge in thinking about what counts as good service design or therapy is to not relegate everything else as though it's sort of blurry and foreground one thing. Sometimes you'll have had this experience. I remember when I signed up for some therapy when I was much, much younger, what really jumped out of them was my being a lesbian. And that, you could really feel the kind of aha-ness of the moment of the professionals thinking, there we go, we've found the cause of whatever Gail's problems are. And that was then part of the main hypothesis for treatment. So these descriptions often say more about the observer or the namer or the describer than the person being observed or described. And that's an idea that we're familiar with from systemic thinking. When I say we, I'm talking to systemic therapists when I say that, that the description often says more about the describer than the person or the thing being described. I think that was Gregory Bateson. But I want to give you an example. For example, a Black autistic man who might not respond appropriately, whatever that means, to a police command could be read as their behavior could be read as a threat or an act of defiance and reacted to by the police with force. But were representatives of white authorities, such as the police, able to see more than a stereotype of a Black man, a Black person, they might then be able to see autism. but which they might do with somebody who was more white presenting, but their foregrounding, the racist foregrounding of blackness, puts Black autistic young men at real risk and makes parents and friends and partners of Black autistic young men and maybe young women very worried. And I mean, I think there needs to be much more education across the police, not just about racism, that for sure, but also about young autistic people. There's some very interesting work Fran and I discovered being done on preparing young autistic people in using virtual reality to prepare for encounters with the police. And it's so beautifully done because it shows the experience. You feel it, see it for the young person, what it means to have these big towering people above them in uniform barking these words at them. And it's partly to prepare the young person, but I remember Fran and I watched this when we were doing a lot of VR research, and Fran just was outraged and saying, it's the police that need training. It's not the young person, the young autistic person, who needs to know how to encounter the police when they approach, but it's the police that need training to meet young autistic people. So you're getting some ideas about how many autistic people can be multiply oppressed through racist or transphobic, ageist, sexist, homophobic ideas. But one characteristic either is more prominent to an observer than others, and this is an example of intersectionality, where something gets splintered off and foregrounded. We want to think more about multi-spectral living, and in this image you see something we've tried to describe. It's lots of lines and dots, and all the lines, each of the lines and all of the dots, if you can imagine them all being in motion. So the dots are traveling up and down the lines, and the lines are constantly wiggling. And the lines and the dots can represent different characteristics, feelings, contexts you're in, all manner of things. And they're all affected by each other. So they're not just parallel to each other, as though they're all separate spectra. They're intertwined with each other. And a picture of a person can be across many contexts. They're unlikely to be the same. There might be some common features that appear and are felt as constants, but there's always movement and change as well. And this puts the responsibility back on professionals to think, well, what would create the conditions for us, for example, talking, doing therapy, in which people might be much more comfortable and feel that it was safer to open up, to talk about stuff, and if it's not talk, to do whatever. So there are many visible and invisible things that are impacting on people, and we can't know them all. So this is an era where we're, through Black Lives Matter, through a more articulate and active lesbian, gay and transgender movements, through a very powerful set of autistic voices and autistic communities and writing from within autism. We're in a very different era where there's much more challenging of theory and practice, and saying, where do these theories come from? What was the era in which they were made up? So our ways of experiencing ourselves, autistic people, queer people, Black people, all of these theories and responses to them, call it practice, have been made up in certain contexts at certain times, but often by people, professionals, theorists, legislators from outside of those communities. So the job we're facing is very difficult. It's getting into the systems and changing the systems. And a bit like Connor's remark a moment ago, if London is going to become the neurodiverse or neuro-inclusive capital of the world, what does London have to do to make that happen? Because it might not mean, let's call it for now, in a provocative sense, reasonable adjustments. Because if the system is set up, built in a certain way with certain kind of fabric and structures and neurotypical shaped doorways, then it might be that there needs to be much more restructuring, rebuilding, and deconstructing before we can expect real change, rather than, now I'm not going to get the quote right, but Audre Lorde, who said, we cannot, I can't remember the exact wording, somebody will help me here, we cannot
we cannot use the master's tools to
dismantle the master's house. We cannot use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. So thank you, Dawn. So we need to uncouple autism from a single spectrum, because it's mean in terms of not seeing the whole person. It's also inaccurate and unethical. And we've got an opportunity to see people as rich, diverse, fluid, multi-spectral. Of course, autism's present, more or less, and in what ways, as Mary Evans in other contexts has said. You've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. So let's think about people as being more fluid, trans-contextual, contextually responsive, influenced by context, and think about multi-spectral living, and ask how the contexts we're living in now enable or disable. What possibilities are they going to create or bring forth? We're going to resist splintering, intersectionality, and challenge medical and white supremacist, general supremacist discourses which filter what we see, and create spectra, ghostly spectra, which we need to render visible. We need to really explore where our theory comes from in order to be able to challenge those theories. And we need to resist some of the history and practice of certain scientific rituals to research and categorize and dehumanize. Remember, most of the money, big money going into autism research is to investigate cause and look at cure. And the cause and cure lobby is, I think, a very dangerous eugenics kind of agenda, which is basically going to result in an attempt to eradicate an entire population group. So we need to be very alert to this, to the sinister origins of a lot of theory. And we need to create new descriptions of experiences from within communities. So from within the autism communities, to foreground autistic people's voices and experiences, but also make allyships within and across other colonized communities. Oops, I should have offered a trigger warning there. Finally, one slide, and this connects for me with my European Jewish heritage as the child of somebody who managed to escape from Germany in 1939 as a Jewish family, and whereas lots of our relatives and other people didn't. So when I realized how many autistic people and other disabled people, brown-skinned people, Romani and Sinti people, and lesbian, gay and trans people were also, alongside 6 million Jews, murdered in the Nazi project of the Second World War Holocaust. Some of you might know this, that Hans Asperger was part of the eugenics project. He might have been, let's say, a nice chap, but he passed on his notes to the Nazis who rounded up his patients and killed them. So, theory is never innocent. And thank you all for listening to that.